This is lesson number 5 in the series of lessons, Music Theory for Banjo Players. Today we're going to be talking about musical intervals, the distance between two notes. Now, a musical interval is the distance between two notes, just kind of like if we were measuring with a ruler. You know, if you've ever done any construction with a tape measure or ruler, you want to know how far it is between two places. You lay that thing down, you see what you get on the ruler between that point and that point. Well, with musical intervals, it's very similar. Notes can either be close together or far apart, and we have to have a way of naming that interval. So an interval has really two names, just like a person, a first name and a last name. Of course, a lot of people have middle names, but musical intervals have first name and last name. And the last name is simply, if you count from one note to the other, how many numbers you count. Like from C to E, we would say C, D, E. Okay, well, that's a third. 1, 2, 3. C, D, E is a third. But that doesn't tell us everything. The first name tells us the actual distance in terms of whole and half steps. So that's a little bit more involved. We'll take a look at that too. Let's just try a couple examples to figure out how far are notes apart from each other in terms of whole steps and half steps. I'm sure you remember the major scale, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. If you look at figure 5.2, this is the pattern for the C major scale. That's the major scale that falls in that pattern without having to have any sharps or flats. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We have half steps between E and F and B and C. So now, let's take a couple examples referring to that figure. And how far is it in terms of whole and half steps between, say, E to G? Well, E to F is a half step, F to G is a whole step, so from E to G is 1.5 steps, or 3 half steps. How about D to A? Well, D to E is a whole step, E to F is a half step, F to G is a whole step, G to A is a whole step. So we have 3.5 steps, or 7 half steps. So we can figure out, if we look at it close, what the actual distance in terms of half steps and whole steps are. Now, what happens if we introduce some accidentals? Let's say we take that same interval, E to G, except now we're talking E to G sharp. Well, we knew E to G was 1.5 steps. G sharp is a half step above G, so we've actually made that interval bigger by a half step. So now we've got 2 whole steps, or 4 half steps. How about the interval D to A? If we put a flat on that D, again, we've lowered him by a half step, so now the interval is a little bit bigger by a half step, and we have 4 whole steps. So that's how we figure the actual distance between them. Okay, now, let's see if we can put those two things together in figure 5.3. This may seem a little bit busy. I'm sure it is a little bit busy, but we're consolidating a lot of information here. Now, you've probably heard the terms major, minor, diminished, perfect, augmented. How do those things work? Well, if we take a major interval, and we'll see what a major interval is here in just a second. We take a major interval and we make it smaller by a half step, then that becomes minor. If we take a minor interval, and again we make him smaller by a half step, that becomes diminished. If we take a major interval and we make it bigger by a half step, that becomes augmented. Now there are a couple of intervals called perfect, the 4th and the 5th mainly. Actually the unison and the octave are called perfect too, but 4th and 5th are the main ones here. If we take a perfect interval, like a perfect 4th or perfect 5th, and we make it smaller by a half step, it becomes diminished. Doesn't become minor. Okay, there's no such thing as major or minor in perfect intervals for 4th and 5th. So we take a perfect interval we make it smaller by half step, it's diminished right now. If we take a perfect interval and make it bigger by a half step, it becomes augmented. All right, now let's take a look at figure 5.3, which kind of summarizes these things. You notice at the very top, we've got diminished, minor, major, and augmented. For the intervals of second, third, sixth, and seventh, and then the bottom half of that, for perfect intervals, we've got the unison, fourth, fifth, and octave. So starting at the top, we won't do all of these, but I think just enough to get the idea. If we have a second, and it's a major second, like C to D, well, how far is it really from C to D? That's a second, because we go C to D, but how many half steps is it? Well, it's a whole step, 2 half steps. That's called major. We make that smaller by a half step, then it's minor. If we take that major interval and we make it bigger by a half step, now it's 1.5 steps, that's augmented. Let's do the same thing for the fourth down on the bottom. If we have a fourth, a perfect fourth is 2.5 steps. For instance, C, D, E, F, C to F is a perfect fourth. Now, if we take that perfect fourth and make it smaller by half step to 2 whole steps, that's diminished. Take that perfect fourth and make him bigger by a half step, so now he's 3 whole steps, that's an augmented fourth. So that table summarizes the first names for notes. That's a little bit involved, I recognize, but work with that table a little bit and play around with it, and let's try a few things. The major scale, of course, is important, and the intervals involved there are, of course, the unison's perfect 1, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and then perfect octave. So, seconds, thirds, sixth and seventh are major, fourth and fifth are perfect. Let's try a couple examples, ascending and descending. And you can use figure number 5.3, figure number 5.3 to figure out the first name by figuring out the intervals. C to D ascending. Okay, well that's a second of some type. C to D is 2. First name is major because the actual distance is a whole step. How about B to E ascending? B, C, D, E. Well, that's a fourth, some kind of fourth. First name is perfect because it's 2.5 steps. All right. Now, how about E to D ascending? Well, that's a long ways. That's about as far as you can go, right? So we got E, F, G, A, B, C, D. So it's a seventh of some kind. Almost an octave, but not quite a seventh. If it were E to E, of course, it'd be an octave. So E to D is a seventh of some type. And the first name is minor because it's 5 whole steps. It's a whole step less than an octave. All right, now, figure 5.5, I list some popular songs. Hopefully you know these. I listed more than one in each category. Hopefully we've got at least one in each category that you're familiar with. And I put these in here to help remember the sound of the intervals. We won't go through all of these, but how about the minor second? Say we take White Christmas. I'm dreaming, ha ha ha, 1, 2, 1. Well, okay, this is I'm dreaming. I'm playing on the B string, and I fretted just the first fret. So that's a half step. It is an interval of a second, but only a half step, so that's a minor. If I went, if I walked up the major scale on that second string, how about happy birthday? Okay, That's the sound of a major second. How about a major third? Well, you know the sound of a chord. 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3. So, first three strings, third string, second string, first string, make a 1, 3, 5. So, what's the song here? How about Michael Rowe, Kumbaya? So you get the idea with these songs. One of the most common, the wedding song. Here comes the bride. Well, what is that interval? A fourth, counting up the major scale. So, how about Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Okay, well, Twinkle, twinkle, little star sound of a perfect fifth. So these are some common ones. Go through these different songs, ascending and descending. Oh, let's do a couple descending before we leave it. How about joy to the world, joy to... That's a half a step. That's a minor second. How about three blind mice, three blind... That's a major second. Hey Jude, major third, and so forth. Okay. Some of the longer intervals. How about for ascending octave? Somewhere over the rainbow, somewhere. That's an octave. All right, so those are some common songs to remember the intervals by. We want to find some intervals on the banjo and just make it up. So let's say we pick the open third string. Can you find a note that's a perfect fourth above there? Either on the same string or on a different string. Let's do it both ways. Okay, well, perfect fourth. Here comes the bride. That puts us at the fifth fret. If we go over from the third string to the second string, we're at the first fret on the second string. So what is this note? That's a C. Well, G, A, B, C. So G to C is a perfect fourth. So here's the challenge. On the banjo, pick a note, any note on any string. Think of an interval. Could be a second, could be an octave, could be a minor seventh, whatever you choose. Could be ascending or descending. And then find that note, even if you have to hunt and peck around till it sounds right. Compare it to one of the songs that has that interval that you're looking for. And then figure out the note names, figure out the actual distance in half steps and whole steps, and see if you got it right. It's a good challenge. And as you do that, you're going to be learning your way around the fingerboard too. Learning intervals and learning the banjo fingerboard.